This is a tutorial on the FIRTPA form and the FIRTPA requirement, and in this short video, you'll be an expert by the end of it, more knowledgeable than most brokers. We actually had a FIRTPA tutorial from 2021, but I realized that the FIRTPA was revised 12/21, meaning that this is the new form that we've used all of last year and all of this year, 2023. This is what we're currently using as real estate agents. Now, it's a simple form that is required, but if a mistake's made, it can have very serious adverse consequences for a buyer. So I'm going to explain what those are because I've experienced them firsthand. I'll show you the mistake that most agents make in relation to this FIRTPA requirement, and we'll go through it very quickly together. So we start by putting in the property address here, very straightforward. Then the transferor's name, transferor being another word for seller. Now, if there's more than one seller, you'll do more than one FIRTPA form. Each seller gets their own FIRTPA form. 3 sellers, 3 forms. That's how it works. Now, because the FIRTPA, which is the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, is all about avoiding people with a foreign status or entities with foreign status skirting U.S. income tax, an exemption must be claimed that you're not subject to it. So it's asking the seller, for individual sellers, individual persons, they're declaring, I'm not a non-resident alien. For entities, and they say corporation, partnership, LLC, trust, etc., that they're saying this entity is not a foreign entity because you're saying I'm not subject to the withholding that's required for foreign persons or entities selling real estate. So you're claiming an exemption, okay? One of these boxes has to be checked. If it's not, this form is incomplete and useless. But that's not the mistake that most agents make. I'll show you where they make the mistake. So down here, I noticed this already, that the difference between this and the old version of the form is the old version of the form automatically asked the seller to furnish this information, their social, their address, their telephone number. This current version now has default verbiage. It says a qualified substitute is going to handle it. What does that mean? Well, it's basically escrow, because escrow collects their own FIRTPA. They're the closest party to all this headache that comes with withholding and money. All the money is swirling around in escrow. And since escrow is the cashier of the transaction, that's who would be withholding the money if the seller is subject to withholding. So by default, it's just putting it on escrow and saying, we acknowledge that escrow is going to be a qualified substitute. Now, this automatically invokes another form being added, the qualified substitute form. But I don't want to jump ahead of myself, and I promise you it won't be confusing when it's done. If there's no qualified substitute, if you're not relying on escrow to do their own FIRTPA form, then this box must be checked. Now, in most transactions that I've witnessed, and that's a lot, usually everyone's just waiting for escrow to do their paperwork, and then escrow will send the buyer a copy of their qualified substitute form. If they're not requiring or waiting on escrow to do that, the seller checks this box. If the seller checks this box, then they must fill this information out, all of it. And the most common problem I see is that this is filled out, but not the social or tax ID, because people worry about security, although I think it's a very low probability that the buyer of your property is going to take your social and do identity theft. But I get it. People are nervous disclosing that information. If a seller checks this box, they have to. That's it. It's that simple. There's no people write on file at escrow, no good. Renders the form useless. And this is where I tell you my story. We had a seller that was a foreign entity and was subject to withholding, and they didn't pay the withholding, and the IRS went after everyone. And I found out firsthand that guess who's responsible if a foreign seller defaults? The buyer. It falls on the buyer. And a buyer, and that's a different conversation, why the buyer's responsible. Basically, the IRS is just pointing their finger at the next person in line, and it happens to be the innocent buyer. Well, the buyer's not entirely innocent because the buyer has the obligation of making sure the seller's not responsible, because an agent should know that the buyer's responsible for withholding if the seller doesn't do it. So how do you protect your buyer? It's real simple. Just do this form. That's it. This form is your get out of jail free card, because when I was talking to the IRS over many hours of wait times and conversations, they wanted to see that the buyer made their best effort to collect this information from the seller so that they could go after the seller and track down the seller and the seller's entity, etc. If you have this and it's not filled out properly, your buyer has no get out of jail free card. If you go and you tell the IRS, I don't have the info, I didn't verify, they go, well, you're negligent and the law says you're responsible, so have fun being responsible for your seller's default. It's scary, it's crazy, but it's real simple to prevent. Just have this filled out properly. That's it. Do not accept a FIRTPA form missing a social. It's that simple. And they're really, the way this form's drafted, it makes it easy. It allows us to be lazy because we can just put it on escrow. Hey, escrow, where's my qualified substitute form? Now, any broker that knows what they're doing should have this, because this form right here is acknowledging that escrow is a qualified substitute. If you're going to put this headache on escrow to collect the FIRTPA information, which is just the seller swearing that they're not subject to withholding, then you should at least have this. So in our office, we require one of two things: the AS form, the FIRTPA form, or the QS. And the in-house transaction coordinators know the easiest thing you can do for the FIRTPA requirement is simply fill out a QS. That's it. Fill out a QS, and I'll show you how. Go ahead and put the date of the purchase agreement, property address, names of the parties. Very easy. Qualified substitute name, the escrow's name. I just wrote an ABC title. Write an escrow's name. Transfers affidavit. So this is, again, acknowledging that the seller, we're writing the seller here. For each seller, you do their own QS form. Remember, one form per seller, right? So we have the seller's name here. Then we put down here, this is where the escrow officer in possession signs this, saying, yeah, I collected that FIRTPA information. It's on file. If the IRS ever goes after your buyer, I have it all over here handy in my file if they need it. That's the important part. Sometimes escrow won't sign this, and if they don't, you go back to square one and collect this. It's quite simple. Get an AS form or a QS form and just make sure they're filled out. That's it. You don't even have to worry about this whole long backstory I'm giving you. One of these two forms, and it has to be fully executed. You cannot have blank lines. That's where you get in trouble. But in this QS form, which is what we use in my office because it's so easy, we just get this filled out, put the seller's name in, escrow signs it, we send it to the buyer. Hey buyer, we've given you notice because this is a requirement in a transaction. The buyer's made aware. The buyer signs off this acknowledgement here. Okay, we understand that a FIRTPA has been furnished to escrow, meaning that escrow has a seller's affidavit. I'm protected. I have nothing to worry about. And they're done. They're just signing off that they're acknowledging it. And that's it. So in summary, CAR Form AS, fully completed out, or the QS. And as long as you have one of these two forms that's complete, then you'll be fine. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thanks for watching.